So we are finally going to finish up chapter 6. So we've been talking all about weather in this chapter, which remember weather is what's happening at any given time, what's it doing outside with the temperature, precipitation, and then we finish the chapter with 6.3, which is all about climates and biomes. And we talk about weather, which is happening on a daily basis. When you add that up and say, what are the patterns that we notice every month, every year in particular areas, that's what equals climate. So the definition of climate is the average weather conditions in an area over a long period of time. So looking at year after year after year, what happens in an area with the average weather conditions. And it's going to depend upon a lot of things. It can depend upon, and I'm going to talk about all of these in a little bit more in a second. So it's going to depend upon latitude, precipitation, elevation, topography, distance from large bodies of water. So look at all of those things, and it can be even more complex than that. So we're just listing 5 things. So when you're in an area, all of those things can help determine what the climate of an area is. These factors, when you look at all 5 of those things, can greatly affect the temperature and precipitation in an area. Where it is, how much water it gets, its elevation, how far it is above sea level. What's the topography like there? Is there a mountain there? Is it flat? All of those things greatly affect temperature and precipitation, which those are probably the number 1 and number 2 factors that are going to determine the climate in an area. When you look at a map of the United States like you see here, most of us are familiar with the different climate patterns that we even have only in the United States. How we can have, think about the weather that we get here in Minnesota versus if you lived in Florida, you lived in Texas, the climate's going to be much different. And look at maybe why that is. Latitude in that area. Think about, we've also been talking about wind patterns in class, how the wind patterns in an area. See, there was even another thing that I didn't have listed on there. So just to talk a little bit more about some of those factors that can affect climate. So latitude, remember, is the distance north or south of the equator. And we've talked a lot about how latitude determines the amount of solar energy a particular area receives. So if you're in a location near the equator, you're going to be getting much more direct sunlight year-round. So you're going to have warmer temperatures. If you live near the poles, near the North Pole, the South Pole, your sunlight is more at an angle. So it's not going to be as direct, making the temperatures not as warm. Typically speaking, higher latitudes are going to have our cooler climates, and then lower latitudes are going to have the warmer climates. So if you're near the equator, near 0 degrees, warmer climates, closer to 90 degrees north, 90 degrees south, it's going to be cooler climates. So remember, it's all about that tilt. Because we're tilted, we get a nice big difference there in sunlight. Something we haven't talked about yet are ocean currents. Ocean currents can also affect the climate of an area. There's a couple of different types of ocean currents. There's what we call surface ocean currents and then deep ocean currents. Surface ocean currents are what their name implies. So they fly or they move along the surface of the ocean. So it's almost like imagine a river that's in the ocean. This can really affect coastal regions. So if you're in an area where there is a warm ocean current, if you're on land and a warm ocean current is near you, it's going to be bringing warm temperatures to where you are. Whereas on the other hand, if you live in an area where a cool ocean current is flowing, it's going to bring cooler temperatures to you. So if you look at this map here, the red areas are going to be warmer, and then the blue ones are going to be the cooler ocean currents. And so probably one of the more famous ones is if you look on the east coast of the United States, you guys can see the Gulf Stream, and that's a warm ocean current, and you can see that it brings warm ocean currents up to northern regions such as Iceland. So we look at Iceland and you see the name and you're like, oh, it must be really cold there. Actually, it's not. It's got a beautiful climate there because the Gulf Stream brings nice warm temperatures there. So climates set up what we call biomes. Biomes are major climate regions that have particular plants and animals that live there, all because of what the climate's like. So think about plants and animals and how we have such a variety of plants and animals on Earth, and how we have some plants that are adapted to living in dry conditions, some that are adapted to living in really wet conditions. You have animals that are adapted to living in cool, animals adapted to living in warm conditions. So these animals and plants live in these areas because of the climates that exist there. So a biome is the major climate region with particular plants and animals. Remember that prefix bio means life. Depending upon what source you look at, you can get a lot of different biomes. Your book divides it up into 6. Nice, it's very simple. There's the 6, but just so you're aware, it can get more complex than that, and I'll talk about a couple of them when they pop up here. When we are referring to, if we look in a biome and we're referring to all the living and non-living factors in that area, that is called an ecosystem. So ecosystems can include plants and animals, which are the living things, but it can also include things like water, soil, nutrients, sunlight. I don't have that listed on there. The rocks in that picture there, the sand underneath the bottom, all of those things would be part of the ecosystem. So when you hear the word ecosystem, don't just think of things that are alive. It's everything in that area, because those factors, when you look at them, sunlight, the nutrients in the soil, they do affect life in an area. So they are all connected to each other. So we're going to just go through the 6 biomes according to your textbook, and I'm just having you write down 1 or 2 major facts. That's sort of like the what should you remember about that biome fact. The first one is desert. We hear the word desert and we think dry, right? And it's true. Deserts have less than 35 centimeters of rain each year. So a very low amount of rain every year. Most of them are found between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south on the globe. So if you look at the picture here, all of the areas that are kind of that really bright yellow that you see on the map there, those would be where we find deserts on Earth. Very large variation in temperature from day to night usually. And think about why that is. We've talked about how land or sand has a really low specific heat. So it has the ability to heat up really quickly and cool off really quickly. So if you have all the sand in an area, we're going to get a big difference in temperature from day to night. So when we think desert, we should think, what are animals and plants that are adapted to not having a lot of moisture? If you're only getting 35 centimeters of rain a year, you got to figure out, how do I hang on to it? So you're going to have really low shrubs and small trees. Their roots are going to go very, very deep. Or maybe they're going to have on the outside of them, they're going to have a waxy covering like a cactus does to really help lock in that moisture, and then put something like spines on you like a cactus does so that animals do not want to come along and eat you. So lots of varieties of cacti, that's the plural that we use. But deserts, low amount of rain. If I'm a plant, how am I going to survive? Also in a desert, so you want to think about if we have these really hot days and then we can get cool nights, you're going to get a lot of nocturnal animals. So those are animals that are going to come out at nighttime when it's going to be cooler. So a lot of your mammals are going to be more active at nighttime, where maybe our animals that like the heat, so think of our reptiles like snakes and turtles, those things are going to be out more during the daytime. Grasslands. Just as their name implies, they are dominated by tall grasses. And the reason why grasslands are dominated by tall grasses is because there's not enough precipitation every year to support really large tree growth. They're usually going to have a large rain in the spring. They're going to have large rains in the fall, but in the summertime, you get a much longer period without precipitation. That dry season in the summer can also often bring fires along with them, which those fires that sweep through every single year are also going to be another reason why the trees are not going to get to grow any bigger, because the fires would wipe them out every year. If you look on the map here, everywhere that's in green is where we find grasslands. We have different types of grasslands on Earth, the ones that you see in North America and the United States. If you've ever been out to think of North Dakota, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, those are the grasslands that we are familiar with. They're also called temperate grasslands, also referred to as prairies. So as you can see, there is not a lot of trees there. If there are, they're very low growing. These are places where you can go out there and you see for miles and miles and miles, really, really long distances. But those are what we see in the United States, or those temperate grasslands and prairies. The other grasslands that we see in the world are called savannas, and they're a little bit different. You'll notice when you look at the pictures here, that doesn't look exactly like North Dakota, Western Minnesota. So same sort of a thing where they're not going to get a ton of precipitation. They're going to get a lot of rain in the spring and the fall. They have seasons where they have fire, but their plant species are a little bit different. And these animals, you should be like, I haven't seen those in North Dakota or South Dakota if I visited there, because yeah, they're not there, not unless you've gone to a zoo. So in a savanna, I often think of a Lion King. Most of us have seen Lion King. That would be what a tropical savanna is called. So still dominated once again by grasslands, but gonna have a fire season as well. Temperate forests. So the word temperate, in between, moderate. So they have a yearly rainfall between 75 and 100 centimeters, so it's a decent amount of rain. They have a distinct season. Spring, summer, winter, and fall. They're also dominated by what we call deciduous trees. So those are the trees that lose their leaves every year. So think about maples, oak, birch, popple. All of those would be deciduous trees. And you should start to see, if you look in the United States there, it should look like, hey, that's creeping up into Minnesota a little bit, because yes, we do have temperate forest here. Southern Minnesota, a little bit more temperate. We're kind of on a boundary between temperate and another one I'm going to tell you in a little bit about, but definitely you start going to southern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. That should look like our backyard, right? And it does. So we're going to have species like white-tailed deer, bear, squirrels. So because we have these 4 seasons, these animals have to be adapted for all of this. So bears, for example, as we know, they hibernate in the winter. It gets really cold outside. Their food sources go down, so they're going to hibernate in the winter. Tropical rainforest, more than 200 centimeters of rain each year. 200 centimeters of rain each year. That is why they're called the tropical rainforest. Imagine being in a greenhouse, but it's a biome. That's what a tropical rainforest is. Because it is near the equator, it's quite warm, right? It's getting those direct sunlight rays year round. There's also little change in seasons. Remember, we talked about what causes seasons. If it's getting the same sunlight year round, you're not going to get a big difference in seasons. It is the most biologically diverse biome on Earth. It has more animals and plants in it than anywhere else. Like I said, it's this greenhouse on Earth. You just have rain and you have all of this precipitation and warm temperatures. It just makes for wonderful growing conditions for organisms. Really a highly valuable biome. There is a lot of things it does for us besides lock up carbon, produce oxygen for Earth, also a lot of medicines. There's a lot of things and products that we actually also get from the rainforest. So most of us should be familiar with these. There's very distinct layers with the tropical rainforest as well. Maybe you learned about them when you were younger, talking about how you have the tree canopy up above, and then down below you can have organisms that never, let's say you talk about animals that live up in that canopy and they actually never even go down on the floor of the rainforest. Really cool animals in the rainforest, very colorful animals. The taiga, this is the largest biome on Earth. If you look at the picture here, everywhere you see purple, that would be where the taiga is. So it may not look like it to you, but technically speaking, you know, when we move this map to 3 dimensions, it is actually the largest biome on Earth. It is marked by long, cold winters and short, warm summers. Does that sound familiar as well? It should, because we are also in the taiga. It is also called the boreal forest. So these forests are dominated by conifers or evergreens. So think of pine trees, because those trees are much more adapted to colder winters than the deciduous trees are. Yes, the deciduous trees have some adaptations, but for the most part, those conifers do a much better job of surviving winters. So once again, this should look familiar to us, right? Go out to northern Montana, northern Oregon, places like that. That should also look familiar. So we have mosses, we have lichens, there's those pine trees. Also animals that are going to be adapted to living in really cold conditions year-round. Finally, the tundra, save the coldest for last, the coldest biome on Earth. It has really long, cold winters with periods of 24 hours of darkness and really short, cool summers with 24 hours of daylight. So coldest biome on Earth. Also, when it does warm up a little bit, another characteristic of these biomes, there is a great deal of insects that will come out. There's a lot of bird species that migrate to the tundra during that time. Another characteristic of the tundra is something called the permafrost. So it never gets warm enough to completely thaw out the soil. You know, for us here, we know living in Minnesota, it's going to be cold, the ground's going to be frozen, and then there'll be a certain period of time where, you know, it thaws out. If you were in a tundra, there's a spot where that never happens, and it's called permafrost. It never just gets warm enough for that to happen. Same thing, obviously, these animals and any plants that are there are really adapted to really, really cold conditions. So think about, when you're thinking about all these biomes, you know, what are their characteristics in terms of temperature, precipitation, and those things kind of drive what sort of organisms live in those areas. And we just broke it down to 6 because that's what your book uses, but just it can get more complex than that. Just really, really cool, fascinating stuff.